welcome everybody. We've got refreshments afterward, and we really hope you'll stand around and get to know each other at the end of our session. So to talk about what's going on, the most up-to-date information we can get about Southeast Asia entrepreneurship and the ecosystems to support entrepreneurship in the region, I have a wonderful panel. Very fortunate that we can be joined by three distinguished experts. Let me introduce them briefly. I'll ask each of our panelists to give us maybe 7 or 8 minutes of prepared remarks. Then we'll go into a Q&A format. So sitting furthest away from me is Ms. Christina Laskowski. And Christina is a strategic advisor and management consultant in consumer and technology companies. For 16 years, she was an investment and M&A banker where she helped to raise over $2 billion. And she was also in the founding team of consumer research at Hambrecht & Quist. She currently serves as the president of STAC, which you see on the slide. And STAC is a nonprofit organization that is focused on driving economic growth in the Philippines through entrepreneurship. And Christina played a key role in transforming STAC into an advisory organization that provides various proprietary services. She presented a 5-year plan to the Philippine president in the year 2010. And her leadership really resulted in a countrywide movement to support tech entrepreneurs, the launch of the first 3 tech angel funds in the Philippines in 2012. And back in 2010, the Philippine president gave her the Golden Heart Award with the rank of Grand Officer, and she's regarded as one of the 100 most influential Filipino women in the United States. Sitting next to Christina is Ms. Madhu Iyer, and Madhu is a seasoned executive for startup companies and investment firms. She has been on the board of directors of a unicorn startup. She's was the chief data officer of a Khosla-funded Series B startup in the San Francisco area. Before coming back to the San Francisco area, she was chief data officer at Gojek in the Philippines. In Indonesia. Where am I today? Sorry. Gojek, the Uber competitor in Indonesia. And she also set up the Singapore operations of Gojek. And before she was in Southeast Asia, she was on the founding team at Intuit for the QuickBooks small company lending platform, QuickBooks Financing. And she's got multiple patents filed in the United States. She started her career as a data scientist at a think tank in Menlo Park, which will remain nameless. And she's worked and lived in many different countries in the region. And sitting closest to me is Mr. Dennis Fernandez, who has over 20 years of experience as an IP attorney in Silicon Valley for the high-tech industry. He is a strategic advisor to leading venture capital firms, including Seven Rosen and Venrock and Charles River Ventures, and also Walden International. His client companies read like a who's who list of people here, including this university. And he's also on the editorial board of the Nanotechnology Law and Business Journal and the board of directors of the Association of Patent Law Firms. And he's on the board of the STAC, right, the Science and Technology Advisory Council. He served on a consultancy for the UN Development Program on Asian Economic Development, and he's also a patented inventor in areas of digital television and sensor networks and also bioinformatics. So we've got an absolutely great panel, and I'm going to ask our panelists to give prepared remarks in the order that I introduced them. So first up is Christina. The floor is yours. Thanks so much for coming.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I was excited to participate in this panel because I've always been an entrepreneur at heart in terms of enjoying to build things. And as we go through the presentation I have today, providing some information, I'll demonstrate to you why it's been exciting to be part of STACK, which has helped build this entrepreneurial ecosystem in the Philippines in a region that is increasingly becoming, I think, more significant, more influential, and more innovative. So on the first slide, what I'm going to do in my presentation is share with you some information about the region, the role that the Philippines plays in the region, all the activity that's taking place in the region. So here on the slide is just a slide demonstrating or showing to you which countries represent the ASEAN member countries. The Philippines is one. ASEAN is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Many of these were developing countries, now considered emerging growth countries. You've probably heard of a number of unicorns that are in the region today. If you went back 6 or 7 years ago, there was very little going on at that level, and now it's become much more active in the region in terms of tech entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship in general. Here's a slide just to demonstrate the growth, how growth of 5 of the ASEAN countries compared to growth of the rest of the world. It's growing at an average 6% as of 2016, or 5%, sorry, 5%.
Okay,
yeah. Great. And direct investment has played a major role. We saw about $274 billion of U.S. direct investment into the region between 2004 and 2016.
Does this say what kind of things people are investing in to do direct investment?
No, not necessarily.
Not really.
A lot of the investment has in the country infrastructure. Those are large ticket items typically, but nonetheless that plays an impact in terms of the amount of capital that's come into the country and into the region in particular. So with regards to entrepreneurship, Southeast Asia is considered a $200 billion digital opportunity. Smartphones, most of these countries have leapfrogged, never really got into purchasing a PC or even having landlines, internet set up through their landlines. It's really a wireless and mobile play in the region, and this is one of the reasons why it's also generated a lot of interest with the market participants.
There's some interesting lines here. Under talent, it says that they see Southeast Asia as a future pipeline of senior C-level talent.
Yeah, exactly. And I was actually going to highlight that because a lot of these countries have never gone through the cycles that we have here in the United States and maybe in other developed worlds. There's a need for more senior level talent, C-level talent to help expand their growth, to bring expertise into the country, and so in terms of entrepreneurial opportunities that are there, if you're looking to become acquainted with the region, if you're looking to do something new, be part of something exciting, helping to build what's happening in the region, it's pretty much sort of the wild west, new frontier. It's definitely the region to be in right now. So here's a slide just illustrating the total funding for Southeast Asian startups, up to 2016. So there's about more than $2 billion that was invested into startups in the region. Most of that is in early stage. So you see a lot of capital going into seed or early stage rounds of financing, although there have been more and more companies that have been receiving later stage rounds and going into the Series G right now. But you see fewer of those. You see more of the early stage type of investments that are going into the startups in the region. And here, again, is just another slide just from another source, CV Insights, just talking about the financing for tech in particular. So we talked about, the previous slide was about investment in startups, and this is more focusing on the amount of investment that's going into startups in particular. And you could see year to date, last year, there were 286 startups that actually received funding, tech startups. So there are technology-related startups that are in the region. In the Philippines, it's been interesting because it was really a consumer type of environment, especially on the entrepreneurial front, starting stores, doing retail, et cetera, but we've seen that transition. You have more companies or more startups in terms of the online commerce, on the online commerce side, and also digital payments and financing side, as well as social enterprise that are emerging. Mm-hmm. And this is what I mentioned earlier. Here's the slide just representing the deals, the funding and the deals that have been funded in the region, and most of them are in the early stage. And again, it's because the region is fairly new in terms of the entrepreneurial activity and tech activity. And this is just more data in particular, just to demonstrate or to show to you how much money has been invested on the seed round, Series A, B, C, and D.
And we will be posting these slides on our website, so it'll be you can access the data.
Here we have some Indonesian founders here, and within the region, Singapore and Indonesia has attracted the most amount of investment. Indonesia is really interesting because it basically has a larger population. There's a lot of excitement. I know that China is starting to invest more and more in the region, but this is just demonstrating where some of the activity is taking place in the region. Singapore also leads in funding, raised for the top 10 funded Southeast Asian companies. You can see here that Lazada, Grab, SEA, AirTrunk, and Trax Image basically raised a significant amount of money. You can see Lazada actually has about $4 billion in total funding. And again, so Singapore definitely leads in that area. And then if you move to the next slide, you'll see that Indonesia follows with Traveloka, Tokopedia, and Gojek. And then Matahari Mall, and then iFlix in Malaysia. And iFlix, sort of the Netflix for Malaysia.
So those are large funds. Those are
large. They're increasing. So over time, the amount of investments have increased, and I think as more and more investors, become aware of the opportunities that are there, the ecosystems have also developed in the region. I mean, there are accelerators in the region. There are more investors in the region. A lot more money being deployed into the region. In fact, Eduardo Saverin, who's one of the co-founders of Facebook, he's based in Singapore right now, and so he has his own fund, and he's also he's a limited partner in Monk's Hill's fund as well. He's one of Monk's Hill's limiteds, and he definitely recognizes the opportunity that exists in the region today. And here I just provided a slide just to show with the logos of the various startups that are in the region, right, in ASEAN and other Asian countries. We don't really focus on India and China because they're pretty large and significant, much more developed. But some of them may appear on this particular slide, just to show you that yes, now we've got a number of startups that are in the region, funding that's in the region, a lot of opportunities that exist. And here, the next few slides, we're just highlighting the most active investors. So 500 startups, I think 70% of their investments are outside of the US. And they've continued to build up presence. They've got 500 Durians, which is another fund. Kylie was just here last week speaking at an event and talking about the opportunities. But they will invest as little as $5,000 in a startup, which goes a long way in Southeast Asia. So that's another thing to pay attention to, that when companies look at the region, they're also looking for runway. And if they can extend the amount of money or the amount of that investment to go much further to help develop, whether it's software or whatever application that they're trying to do or whatever business that they're trying to build, it's definitely much more attractive in the ASEAN region because it can go much further with the talent there. And here we provide a list of the other top Southeast Asian investors. So here are some of the newer Southeast Asia funds. If you're not familiar with VC investment in the region, I thought it would be helpful to show this because, again, it demonstrates that because of all the activity and opportunities that are in the region, we have more funds that are actually emerging, to focus in this area. And the Chinese have actually, Chinese companies have actually taken a lot of interest in what's happening. They're starting to participate in basically inject significant amount of investment in other companies. And you can see some of the activity that they've done between 2015 and 2017. And then here are some Philippine startups that I just wanted to share with the audience that have emerged that are 4 years and younger. So Accudine actually helps, they're just a more efficient way to address invoicing. Some of the small businesses are strapped, and what they do is they actually collect on those invoices for the businesses. So they'll cover the invoices and they'll collect on their behalf so that the small businesses are not constrained by having a lack of capital because their invoices aren't paid. I think sometimes invoices take about 4 to 5 months to receive payment, and they came up with a very interesting solution, and they won a competition last year. ZipMatch is just it's very similar to Zip Realty, which is a platform for buyers and sellers to find real estate, to learn about what real estate's available, and also to market your property.
Okay, so thank you. While I'm changing the slides, I've got a couple of follow-up questions for you. Mm-hmm. The first one is really, so Southeast Asia, to what extent is that kind of a fictional entity? I mean, you've got 11 or 12 different countries, right? 11 different countries in ASEAN. Mm-hmm. And each country really is kind of different. Are you starting to see the region kind of hang together more business-wise?
Well, I've seen it here. So another group that we formed, that Stack is a part of, we co-founded a group called the ASEAN Alliance, which is essentially a partnership between SF Asia, which is the Office of Economic Development in San Francisco, Block 71 SF, which is the Singaporean startup home here, incubator in San Francisco. MDEC Americas, which is Malaysia Digital Economic Corp. We also have a partnership with Savada, which is Silicon Valley Technology Alliance, which represents Indonesia, and then Creative Ventures, which represents Thailand. Now, I bring this up because what we recognized is each of us, our organizations are serving as a bridge between home country and Silicon Valley, and we felt that a collaboration of sorts would make it, would be much more powerful for the entire region, because what we envision is a region where you're going to start sharing talent. There might be some challenges today in terms of how easy or how challenging it is for you to go between countries, but we feel that the region in itself can be somewhat similar to Silicon Valley and serve as a melting pot where all these talented individuals from the various countries come together and work together to build companies. And we've seen that. Singapore has a number of Philippine founders. There was an Indonesian startup that also had Philippine founders. So there is this sort of cross-pollination that's happening within the region. Okay,
great. Why don't we move on? And after the next set of comments, I'll start to ask some more questions. Madhu, Ms. Madhu Iyer, if you would talk about your comments.
Perfect. If you can just the next slide and then the slide after next, because this is just an introduction to me.
Well, actually, okay. All right.
You've done a great job introducing me. Thank you. I wanted to talk more. This was, it was a great macro sort of an introduction to Southeast Asia and the landscape. I wanted to drill down. And, I most recently spent time at Gojek and, in a private equity firm in Singapore, building fintech startups all over Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Philippines primarily. On the ground, what we see is, I've just seen two big trends that I wanted to highlight, and there's a ton, and it was very difficult for me to sort of pin down the two, and I can talk about the rest in the comment sections. But Chinese investments and regional, cross-border activities are two really big ones. And in terms of the Chinese investments, next slide, the same thing that Christina kind of had up. It's such an important and omnipresent, activity right now. China started in 2015 with Alibaba and their financial arm and financial Tencent, Didi, and JD.com, which is a big e-commerce player in China, obviously. They started investing in, if you look across Lazada, you look at, and then, MDAC and Mint, you look at Gojek, you look at Grab and Traveloka, you have not just different domains. Lazada is e-commerce, Tokopedia is e-commerce, you have MDAC and Mint, HelloPay, they're all fintech, and then you have the sharing economy, which is Gojek and Grab, and then you have Traveloka, which is travel e-commerce out of Indonesia. You have these different domains, but almost every important country in Southeast Asia is sort of covered by China. You have HelloPay, which is Malaysia. You have, Touch and Go is Malaysia. You have, Gojek obviously is Indonesia. Lazada is Singapore and all over. There's HelloPay is Philippines. And then you even have something like an Ascent Payments, which is Thailand. So they've got they've basically got a hand in every single country and investments in different domains. And I think it's a really, it's a smart move. And I also and this is, my own sort of personal opinion, but an opinion that's shared by a lot of VCs on the ground there, that there's a lot of people from the US trying to get involved, but there's not this substantial an involvement other than Amazon, perhaps, which is, on the ground. You even have Obiki, which is basically a content firm out of Thailand. So they've covered everything in different domains.
Can I ask, before we go on,
yeah.
Is this purely portfolio investment by the Chinese companies, or do you think that they're really moving toward foreign direct investment and then on toward takeover?
And so my next slide was sort of going to allude to that, but I think it's the latter. I think it's Lazada. The Lazada mothership has truly arrived in Singapore. Lucy Peng is now heading Lazada. Mm-hmm. She's been sort of transported from the China office over to Singapore. And, that speaks volumes. Yeah. So I think it's more than foreign investment.
Okay.
They want to own is what I think it is, yeah. Just the way they've kind of moved. This is a deep dive example, Gojek, which is where I was at. It's an example. Gojek has just raised 1.2 billion. Google has invested, and I think Google has a strategic next billion users sort of an angle there. And I'm happy to note really as an American that Google is now there in an investment at Gojek. But obviously Tencent has come in and invested as well. And here you have, Go Ride, Go Car, you have logistics, you have food, you have other smaller services like GoTix and GoMart, and this is across 50 cities in Indonesia, and underpinning all that is cashless payments in the form of GoPay. And so I just, wanted to kind of give you an example of how much there is a penetration from a Chinese investment point of view, in Indonesia. And I think the other big trend is the regional cross-border activity. I know you'd asked this question to Christina. I think that for e-commerce, Lazada is headquartered in Singapore, but it has offices obviously in the Philippines. It's all over, and I also think that a major sort of a synergy with e-commerce, with the growth in e-commerce and cross-border is logistics. You have fulfillment, you have last mile deliveries, you have software solutions that enable faster e-logistics. And really, if you think about it, you would think logistics is a single market play, but the market is so underdeveloped that UPS and DHL kind of bigger players find it very tough to compete at the low per package cost levels, and so you have like Ninja Van from Singapore that's expanded into Indonesia, and so there's a lot of interesting sort of like interplay that's happening from companies in Indonesia penetrating to Singapore and vice versa. And of course, we all know that the share economy, which is Grab and Gojek, Gojek is now planning to expand to the rest of the region. Grab is already present, so it's and of course fintech with remittance and cross-border payments and cashless, which is a huge push. I really think that cross-border is sort of the only way to go in Southeast Asia, as no one country has both supply and demand. And there's the ASEAN, the way they do business. There's the tax implications. It's pretty, it's all built. The ecosystem is built to sort of help each other.
So I gotta follow up before we go further. How do you see the competition between Grab and Gojek playing out from now? You're independent now. You don't represent anybody. So.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that disclaimer. Grab has raised a lot more money than Gojek. And Gojek has sort of been the underdog in terms of raising money. And then of course now the Grab and the Uber merge. That's a powerful, that's obviously a powerful indicator of Grab's omnipresence in the area, in the region. I do think that Gojek is, it's a personal bias. I love the Indonesian ecosystem. I think Gojek has excellent market potential in terms of just the different kinds of things that they've done very early on.
All of that deep dive, that slide.
It's just like from Go Massage to Go Tix. They want to be in every single sector. And I also think that they've got something, Go Studio now, which is content. So they really are getting into everything in a very big way. And so Gojek has always had the advantage of the diversity. And Grab finds it, and they had Go Resto, which is restaurants above food. So I think this mentality of Gojek to sort of be extremely nimble when it comes to different product offerings, it's going to be it's for everybody to see. And 50 cities in Indonesia is a very difficult number to beat.
Thank you for being willing to speak out on that. Okay, thanks very much, Madhu. So kind of as a follow-up question for you, the brands are all different, because the Americans are not there, right? You're not you do see Amazon trying to do things and so forth, but this is a very different ecosystem in terms of the startups that have been successful and so forth. Do you see the American companies waking up, or what do you think is going to happen?
I think I just think that the way of doing business in Indonesia, in Southeast Asia is a little different. People sell the way people use Facebook or Instagram here. So I guess a bigger comment is that everybody uses Facebook and Instagram. So it's not like the services and the products are not there. It's just that there is it's a gap. There is a gap between the products that people are using and how they are using it. For example, people in Indonesia sell stuff on Instagram or sell stuff on Facebook. And the Americans don't use Facebook for the same reason, or Instagram for the same reason. So the reasons we use our products is very different, the way we use it here and the way we use it there. It is a very hyper local play at the moment. And you have to understand the demographic and how things are done there. There is also the entire urban and rural mix, which we have to consider. By 2025, even half of the population is still going to be in rural areas in Southeast Asia. So that's another huge gap that I think it's going to be difficult to be sitting here and seeing.
No, this is one reason the opportunities for Gojek to offer all of those services
are huge.
The infrastructure hasn't been rolled out yet.
Right, exactly. And the infrastructure has not been rolled out yet.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Dennis, you're going to talk to us about innovation in the Philippines.
I will try. Thank you. Yes, I've done a lot of different things. I teach patent strategy in the Philippines. I help Christina on Stack. I manage a patent firm in Silicon Valley, and I launched one of the earliest venture funds in the Philippines, also in Singapore and Malaysia, from Walden. And I go back there to go scuba diving. It's one of the best places to go. The biodiversity is amazing. I wanted to just share a few takeaways. One is the context you were alluding to in terms of demographic influence. The Philippines is very much a crucible of colonial influence, even today. And in fact, to the point where it's difficult to identify what it means to be Filipino. Because the Filipinos you meet here tend to be identified with their regions as opposed to the core Filipino identity, which arguably some people think doesn't really exist because of the colonial influence by Chinese. Even today, the investors, Spanish were there for well over 300 years. So most Filipinos, have Spanish last names, they're Roman Catholic, and they love Christmas. Okay.
But it's interesting because, a lot of people may not be aware of how many dozens of languages there are in the Philippines.
The dialects show the fragmented, when you have an archipelago of thousands of islands, it's like koala bears that evolved in Australia. Well, Filipinos pretty much stayed on their islands for a long time, and they kept speaking their local dialects, and then even today. The American influence is significant, and you suggested the branding question. Probably more than any other country in Southeast Asia, the Philippines is probably the most Americanized and most receptive to American-style marketing. Even with recent pressure from the Duterte presidency to challenge, the parental control by the U.S. on the Philippines. All right, so you've got 100 million or so Filipinos, very high poverty rate. I've seen numbers much higher than 21%. But it's the fastest growing country in that region economically. And that's driven largely by a very stable banking sector and a strong political base compared to previous years of, autocratic leadership. Very small entrepreneurial community, 300 or so. Only 10 were VC funded last year. Okay, so that's an opportunity, but then you have to ask yourself, why not? Okay, part of it is the infrastructure is really hard to, when I go out there and go diving in the remote sites, even though I have my smartphone, it's very hard to find communication. But there's a lot of cyber cafes. So it's a fragile infrastructure. It's changing now quite a bit. Drivers, Christina suggested earlier, a lot of internet-related services. One big area is in healthcare. Okay, so the Philippines produces lots of nurses and doctors. Most of them get exported. There is tourism for healthcare to the Philippines, okay, like other places. And so that has a good platform for exploitation by a strategic entrepreneur. In the US, there's over 3 million Filipinos, and almost 2 million of those are in California. Okay, and this context is not just statistically interesting. This is strategically important, and so I think, having done the VC deals in the Philippines, you cannot ignore what that means strategically, because it's a tight community, very Americanized. The other piece of that puzzle on the colonial influence is the Philippines is largely controlled, not by government, but by a few wealthy, either Chinese or Spanish families. And so when we set up our venture funds there, you pretty much have to pick who your strategic family partner is and then run with that. And then from that point on, you're the rival of the other families. So that's what it means to do business in the Philippines, even today. All right. Philippines leads in internet use, especially through social networking in the region. And it's not surprising because of the nature of, it's a very flamboyant culture, very vocal, a lot of fun. I saw one study a few years ago that ranked the Philippines as one of the happiest countries in the world, even though it's one of the poorest, with earthquakes, volcanoes, typhoons, super typhoons. And yet the happiness index is extremely high, like ahead of Canada. Canada is also very high. Anyway, so this is important. You have to understand that you have this kind of context in terms of social use. And I just want to share that anecdotal point. Next slide.
Okay.
And then finally, this is kind of the segue to Christina's ASEAN stuff. My take on the ASEAN thing is they would love to unify like EU or the United States. But it never happened when I was there doing business in the mid-90s. I think what's unifying ASEAN today is political against China that's militarizing the region. So there is concern that China's outreach to secure Southeast Asia from a military standpoint is forcing the ASEAN countries to decide whether they will stand on their own or be part of the Chinese umbrella. Okay.
And actually, under the new president, that's been there's been some changes.
It's a real issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a real issue. Philippines won a World Court decision about Chinese development of a coral reef and built a military base on it. So if you want to learn one Filipino word, thank you, memorize salamat. That's me with my sharks.
With your shark repellent iPad, okay.
Yes, they just got eliminated. So.
Dennis, thank you very much. So, do you really think there's only 300 startups in the Philippines? I mean, I'm kind of curious what they're counting, because, on the one hand, we try to make a distinction between Silicon Valley style startups that are really going to grow hugely and go to exit versus local SMEs, right? Because there must be a ton of SMEs in the Philippines.
There's a lot of real family-owned businesses that have evolved into local industries. Some of them are heavily agricultural, like sugar and other things. I'll tell you how hard it was when Walden, I managed our Philippine fund, also from San Francisco, the Regional Asian Fund. I had literally to go island hopping and just to find deals. And they were tough. They were like prawn farming and a new mall or some kind of, it was low tech. And as a patent attorney, and I have like my own portfolio of patents, it's not the fabric for innovation to innovate ahead of the global curve. It's not a driver, it's a follow-on behavior. Okay, this is part of the colonial thinking, I think. And I don't want to be harsh because, I want to support the country and wish them well, but it's not going to be a place where they're going to move the needle or disruptively create something new that will make people. Okay, I just don't see that.
Well, it could be
okay?
you build up the first industrial base before you have to disrupt it.
Yes, and so I think there is a strategic flaw in presuming that you can just export Silicon Valley angel VC funding models to a country that has major infrastructure shortcomings, okay? And now the groups that are fundable are real, okay? So 300, maybe 500. I remember when Christina was out there helping them write business plans over like a 4-year period, coaching them. It was really hard, okay? But we tried, we want to help, we love our country.
And also, not to pick on the Philippines, a couple of years ago in this series, we had a speaker from Thailand, and his main point was, don't try to put the Silicon Valley model into Thailand. This is just not the way people develop businesses. You're starting to see more of it developing this way.
Well, it's certainly a local approach. I don't think, even when we started our work, we didn't have that mindset of we're going to transplant Silicon Valley here. What we're going to do is basically implement best practices, but localize our approach. So it was very local,
Okay.
and even the businesses that we reviewed may not be embraced by the market here, but from a local perspective, they were solving problems in the local market, and and it's since evolved. But yeah, we did not have that mindset of we're going to transport Silicon Valley here. Our mindset really was let's implement best practices and support entrepreneurship as a way to self-sufficiency. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but I think that, I completely agree that it's a different way of developing businesses there. But when you come to trends, there's AI, there's cashless payments, there's fintech in terms of lending, and most of these are, and mobile, mobile is an omni-channel really, and most of these require skills that are sort of valley-like. And so even though you're doing business there in a different way, you have to build the businesses thinking about the demographic and the classical sort of what's adoptable there. You have to think about the skills that are very valley-like. Online marketing and digital advertising, they're reality. You need to have those skills. They're very sort of, they're very translatable there. And also AI, robotics. Anybody now in marketing platforms, they say they have chatbots and it's all sort of robotic process automation going on. So there is skills that can be taken from here and that are sort of just, mirrored there.
Right.
Okay.
Strategic thinking as well.
And strategic thinking as well. Yeah.
Sometimes they're stuck in a box and you've got to help them think through, what's going to happen next and how do you position yourself against competition or potential competition.
So I've got one question for all three of you. I'd like to get your individual opinions on, partly because nobody mentioned something I was kind of expecting you to mention. And part of this is because I gave you absolutely no instructions on what to prepare. Nobody mentioned the rise of the middle class and how that's changing spending patterns. I think it's implicit in some of the macroeconomic data that you shared with us. But I wonder how the middle class might change the nature of business opportunities and also what role it will play in more Silicon Valley style entrepreneurship. Christina, why don't you go first?
Are you talking about in the Philippines itself?
I'm talking about all across the region. Because I think that one of the things that impresses me is that all of the countries in the region are moving into that area where, per person GDP or per person income is sort of middle class-ish. And the macroeconomists say that, people start to buy cars. They start to use their money in a different way. They start to invest more in their kids' education.
Well, education is a priority, so I don't think that will ever go away in the region.
That's not new.
Yeah, that is not new. In terms of spending, you do definitely see more of the the middle class or even the younger generation spend more. I don't know how that's impacting saving though, because I haven't seen, they might be spending more, but are they saving as much as, generations past? But there is an increase in consumption and also the way that they consume, right? The on-demand way of consuming, the immediate, basically they want things now. But at the same time,
what does this do for entrepreneurship?
What was that?
What does this do for entrepreneurship?
Well, it's providing solutions, right, that sort of meet their needs, and they're more receptive to business models that their parents and grandparents weren't even exposed to back when, being able to send money, being able to share the cost of the cost of a meal, right? I mean, you've got solutions like Venmo, where everybody you could spot your friend or do this. It's very different. And even just mobile payments, et cetera, that's very different from how, generations past were able to consume and remit and do things.
Yeah.
So that's definitely changing behavior on the middle class.
Okay. Madhu?
I think, rise of the middle class income is sort of implied in some of the fundamental product innovations that you're seeing. That entire segment of fintech, which is, Mint and Ascend, they are all about, Ascend money is all about how do you get people that don't have access, how do you make like frictionless online experiences come true? And there's the O2O, which is huge, offline to online. There are being solutions that are being imagined, which is again, Silicon Valley to there. Silicon Valley doesn't have this offline to online problem as much as, Asia does. And so how do you kind of make the entire experience of having online, online availability, basically it being available to the middle class that might not be in the urban areas, even people that are in the urban areas who might not have like credit cards. And so there's being solutions imagined for that. There is an entire industry that's kind of rallying around the rising middle class in every single, whether it be cashless payments, whether it be, fintech vis-a-vis fintech, whether it being insurance for people, whether it being e-commerce. There is a startup out of Philippines, which basically is Lazada, partnered with them. Basically, it was all about how do we make the products on Lazada available to the lower middle class people that are just, having an income rise. And so, it's implied, it's implicit, even the last mile delivery, logistics. These are all solutions that are kind of, targeting just that.
Okay, good. Dennis?
I think there's a myth that the Philippines is a democracy because you see this vibrant press that debates and they vote. However, if you really understood what's going on, you realize it's a feudal structure with an oligarchy. And so the notion of a middle class, which got gutted out in previous decades through overseas workers and a lot of immigration to places like the United States and Canada, I think it chilled this notion of economic revitalization through the middle class, either through creating a growing market or as a source for entrepreneurial activity. So I'm a little skeptical that the Philippine middle class will drive, Philippine entrepreneurial growth. I think it will come out of the elite layer, okay?
So top down.
Yes, and they have the resources and connections, and they're very global, and some of them are in this room, and so they have access to ideas and capital. But the Philippine middle class, to me, continue to struggle. Okay, and it's very hard. It's very hard to bridge over this social gap, like in India. Okay.
Yeah, certainly a relatively small number of wealthy families controls quite a bit of capital in India too.
Yeah, and I think if you understand that, I'm not judging that as good or bad. I'm just saying, look, that's how it really is.
Yeah.
Once you use that as your starting point and you're realistic, then you can articulate a strategic business plan.
Okay, so I'm going to go with one more question, then we'll open up to Q&A from everybody. And I'm going to start with you, Dennis. I think one of the things that, if you haven't been to the Philippines, that might surprise you is the kind of very active technology cluster there. I mean, there's a lot of people who do good software development there and who are really quite heads up in terms of new trends in software. What role do you think that's going to have going forward? Is that going to play a role in kind of a big economic level?
Yeah, I think it's real, and it is competitive. And so, Christina and I and our colleagues in Silicon Valley mentor these guys when they come here, and we introduce them to customers. And it's in part because there's a certain layer of know-how that it's really agnostic to where you are on the planet, okay? So you can create AI applications or, things that are purely running off smartphones from anywhere, okay? And so you have the cost advantage. And it's exciting for me because it wasn't like that when I was funding deals in the Philippines in the mid-90s, because it just wasn't even close to that, okay? But now, the quality of their vision, okay, and their technology is very competitive. So it's coming, okay, now.
So, kind of looking across the region, Madhu, you were talking about talent. Do you think technology talent will support the continued growth? What about management talent? How do you see the needs and possible solutions to those problems?
Yeah, I think, it's. I have to agree with Dennis a little bit here. There is the brand, this is kind of bringing the branding umbrella together and the wealthy families. America has a huge brand in Southeast Asia, and that's the university brand. People who've gone to Stanford and Harvard and any of the Ivy League universities, or people who've studied here that go back, that they are the ones that get the opportunities to manage these startups, found these startups, get the access to the capital, and so there is that, which is the sort of the. They're the ones that are present there in terms of the management teams. There's a lot of people from outside going back. In terms of home ingrown talent, I see that there is a lot of need, and they are moving up quickly because of the need that there is. I do think that there is a little bit of a struggle to kind of quickly cover that gap. But there's a lot being done. There's a lot of accelerator programs. There's a lot of programs that are catering to, like Founder Institute, like Singularity. People have now, reached that online. So there is that. But I think there's
again. So I'm going to play on your independence now. When you were working with Gojek, was it hard to find people who could be data scientists, people who could be coders even? Just how did you deal with that problem?
Yeah, I think management is hard. I think data science is even harder.
Yeah.
It's unfortunately data science was new when I was back there a few years back, and India, China have more mature data science, data engineering ecosystems in terms of the talent, but. It was hard, but I think Indonesia and the Philippines are putting a lot of time into their university programs now to teach these subjects and to have, independent, for example, the Python Society or the R Society of Indonesia. There's a lot of meetup groups that are coming up in the United States style that are putting in a lot of effort to have homegrown talent, but it's difficult, and it's definitely much more. There's much more advances to be had there. Yeah.
Christina, from your perspective.
No, I completely agree. I mean, one of the things that we wanted to do differently with Stack is that we recognized that access to knowledge networks, et cetera, were reserved for a certain group of people, and it's typically those who have studied abroad, have gone to like an Ivy League university. In fact, we met with the managing partner of Endeavor Philippines, which is basically this global initiative to support local companies that have the opportunity to be global. And they showed a slide, and one of the questions I asked was, what is the correlation between all these founders and where they went to school and where they live? Because that is, I mean, it tends to be reserved for that elite group. Typically, full disclosure, 5 of my board members went to Stanford, but when we started to do our work in the Philippines, we wanted to level the playing field.
Yeah.
We had competitions. We said it's going to be national. We're going to go to all the regions. We're not going to be exempt. We are not going to host these events. We're going to ask the local communities to host, because the other disconnect or the other gap is, even though you tell these founders how it should be done, what should be done, unless they actually go through the process and an iterative process, it is a process in which you learn.
Yeah, it's like
And-
driving a car.
Yeah, exactly.
Unless you actually do it, you don't learn it.
They can read textbooks, they can watch videos, they can
Yeah.
do all these things, but until you failed or until you've made a mistake or you've done things, you're not going to really pick up that knowledge. And so, we're trying to help. Even with STAC, we have conversations with the Philippine government, and to help address this gap, they've got this program called the Balik Scientist Program. And I actually participated as a scientist part of the program, even though I don't have a science background. But it was to serve as a prototype for a Balik Technopreneur program where we can encourage this inflow of talent into the country, where they could be hands-on and really work with some of the founders and entrepreneurs so that they could share their knowledge with the founders and entrepreneurs in the country. So that's one way that we're trying to address it. But I think it is a gap. I mean, the whole ecosystem sort of kind of came, I think, with the smartphones, in 2007, I think that coupled with some other things that were going on in the region, broadband access to all of this, that helped, served as a catalyst for all this activity that happened. And so it was a learning process for all the ecosystem participants. And I think we're just seeing, a few evolutions of what's happening in the ecosystem today.
Yeah, go ahead, Dennis.
So years ago, I analyzed what lessons we could learn from how Singapore, Taiwan, and Korea, South Korea, transitioned from heavily agricultural economies into, globally competitive industrial infrastructure, cars, stuff like that. And there were a lot of factors, but one driver that helped catalyze those economies 30, 40 years ago was government resolve to build early stage industries like Shinshu for semiconductors and strong incentives and recruiting talent focused on vertical markets. When I look at the ASEAN cluster, except maybe for Singapore, I don't see, heavy capitalization and regulatory biasing by the government to trigger that kind of national mission. And that's what's missing. Because you're not going to get it from entrepreneurs writing apps or early stage
Is this
funds.
just a function of how much money the governments have and other things they have to do
The money's
with it?
there. I talked to the guys
Okay,
with the Asian
okay.
Development Bank and the World Bank. They'll fund infrastructure deals
Yeah.
that will fix, national needs like electricity and, stuff like that. But this requires national leadership, and it's risky because they have to commit to something that they may not fully understand, like electric cars,
Right.
or a blockchain transactional platform, or CRISPR healthcare technologies. I mean, they have to commit. And the political will to do that in countries that are struggling with all kinds of localized factors, it's not there, okay? Philippines is going after the drug dealers,
Yeah.
okay? I mean, that's their national resolve.
Well,
Even in Silicon Valley, right? Defense helped.
Yeah.
kind of
yeah,
spur all the
they
activity
did.
That's
here.
what
For a long
happened
time,
here.
that was
Yeah.
a big thing. Yeah.
You need that, and it needs to be sustained for a while.
Yeah, we had a good generation out of the Cold War. I mean, it's a strange thing to say, but it's true.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is really pre-innovation. It's R&D funding. But that really has helped the Silicon Valley. But the other thing about here is we're very much an innovation region, relatively urban, 100 kilometers by 120 kilometers in size maybe. And you don't have to go inland very far until the American economy is very different.
Oh, yeah.
So are you going to see urban regions kind of develop the same kind of regional innovation center characteristics in Southeast Asia? Kind of like, we moved ahead of everybody else. And there's a national danger there, because if the rest of the country doesn't feel like they're benefiting from your development, eventually you will be punished for it. And, Silicon Valley may be punished over the next few years. Look at our problems with Facebook. What do you think? Are you seeing urban centers kind of growing up in Southeast Asia that are exciting?
Well, in the Philippines, there's still concentrations where there's a lot of the startup, activity. It's spread across the country, but then there are definitely pockets. But you can say the same thing here in this country, right? And
Yeah.
And we're hoping that it spreads. But again, if there are individuals that are attracted to some of these opportunities, they're going to go where the opportunities are,
Yeah.
right? And then it creates sort of this, this ecosystem or mini ecosystem within an ecosystem that drives that.
Yeah.
Well, Ro Khanna is trying to change that here, right? He's having visits with other states and rural, rural towns,
Yeah.
and hoping to spread the innovation across this country.
Okay.
And
Okay.
we're hoping that happens in the Philippines, that it's not just limited to those regions. That's one of the reasons why we wanted, to do the national competitions and encourage folks all across the country, that if they have an idea, that there's support and there's a network, and bring the government's attention to what's
Yeah.
going on in those areas.
Madhu, any comments about other parts of the region, either Indonesia or?
Yeah, I think, Jakarta is obviously, a huge power center for all kinds of startup activity in Indonesia. There is Singapore is, just kind of dovetailing on some of the comments about Singapore. There would be no conversation about startups without mentioning the words blockchain and ICO, in the current environment. And Singapore has, been, the stance is a little, the MAS's stance on ICOs has been sort of somewhat on the fence. And I know I'm sort of digressing a little bit, and I'll jump back to your question. It's just yesterday was the first, ICO that came out of Singapore, Bluezell, raised $19.5 million in an ICO. So Singapore is really kind of doing its best. And so it's a huge epicenter for a lot of activity. It's regarded as one of the most friendly ICO countries in the world now. And that's sort of leaps and bounds, in terms of taking an innovation, recognizing it early on, and leapfrogging in front of everybody else. But yeah, I think just like the US, Southeast Asia also has hotspots where there's just a lot more accelerators, a lot more, founders that want to live, and a lot more talent lives in those parts of the world, So that also, talent is a huge thing as well.
Okay, thanks. Let's open the floor to questions. Go ahead, Walter. You first.
After listening, I got the impression that the business model involved with three elements. Number one, the wealthy people to build the infrastructure. And number two, you found out ads which can serve the market at the bottom of the pyramid. And number three, you collect a lot of small money to grow a big money. That's your profit. Am I correct?
When you say business model, what do you mean by business
model
model?
of the whole entrepreneur model.
So this is the way the ecosystem works
That's
in the
right, the
country at a
ecosystem.
national level. Okay.
So is it the way it works over that region?
Well, one thing I noticed you left out is what Dennis, you said is not there, and that's the government kind of really, this is the direction we're going to move.
Yeah, the Philippine economy is very retail-centric, okay? So they don't design new chips or design new cars. So they consume. And there are some businesses that are highly profitable in a difficult market like the Philippines, like Goldilocks, restaurant chain, and it fits exactly the checklist you just talked about. So it's a microeconomy that caters to very cost-sensitive services. Yeah, so if you do that, and you really have, I remember when I used to visit there quite a bit, it always freaked me out that there would be guards at every major bank office with submachine guns, okay? And I thought, why? They must need that, okay? And so you just have to realize that you're doing business in a difficult environment, okay? It doesn't mean you can't make money, okay? And your checklist is a good distillation of what you need to do when you embark on that journey. I think it's very doable. This is why I kept talking about, here are your context, demographically, culturally, you know, the whole crucible thing, the whole expat, Filipino, American community. Okay, you have to exploit that in a way that a good entrepreneur can scale it, okay?
I think, I mean, to that point, I think that's why, you know, when countries, when investors look at countries in the ASEAN region, right, they're looking at market opportunity. You saw a slide there where there's 22% in poverty in the Philippines. That number could be higher. What is the total available capital? I mean, what is your market? And so if your market is fairly small and then it's represented by people who can only transact in small amounts, yeah, you are going to be targeting this basically this group of consumers who can only pay the 5, 10 pesos or 100 pesos or whatever it is, but you add it all up and it becomes more meaningful. And in a market like the Philippines and maybe other countries, you might have a higher profit margin. I mean, if you just go to the side store, it's called the Sari Sari store, they still sell things in sachets, which would be a sample shampoo container here. They sell that. They can make money on that, right? And so it's kind of like the same mindset too, in terms of if you're going to transact online, with delivery or whatever it is. I mean, sometimes the small increments can actually generate significant amount of profit in your, with regards to the business. But it is, you do have a limited market. It's unlike the market that we have here in the United States. There is your total available market for whatever it is that you're selling is going to be less than what it is in the developed economies.
Madhu, comments on this? Okay, I saw your hand.
So, pretty much every successful startup story I've heard has started with a founder talking about themselves identifying a need that they themselves had. And so I'm wondering, from my own standpoint, being someone who was born and raised in America, even though I've gotten what at this point I certainly hope is a very high value education, I don't necessarily know where I would fit into, or if I fit into a startup space in Southeast Asia. So I'm just wondering if this is something that interests me, how would I go about getting my foot in the door? I mean, past attending talks like this, and there are these little, side projects that happen around Stanford, but how do I get connected to a 2-person company in the Philippines that does something related to what I do?
You talk to me, you could talk to Jojo right there, who has his own accelerator in the Philippines, Launch Garage. I mean, we're accessible. Our role as a nonprofit organization is to serve as a bridge. And even not just the Philippines, if there are other countries that are of interest, we can help facilitate those introductions. But you have to ask yourself too, not just your education, but what is it that you're interested in? What have you been doing? And then you could do that match in terms of what you have to offer a company and what the company can benefit by having you join their team, right? It's a two-way.
Can I turn that around a little bit?
Mm-hmm.
Madhu, Gojek developed in Indonesia at a time when I wouldn't say Uber was asleep at the switch, but Southeast Asia was not really noticed by these kind of sharing economy, ride-sharing companies. Is that actually a better kind of model, because now that Gojek is doing well, they're getting lots of large amounts of funding from international players in that space? Or do you see it as American entrepreneurs would do well to kind of consider their expansion opportunities earlier?
Yeah, I think, and that's a great question. I do think that some of the things that I've been toiling with my mind is that American entrepreneurs, when they're in the Series A or even not seed stage, but I would say anything beyond Series A, Asia is a huge growth opportunity, and people just can't be bothered because they don't know how to do business. For example, I've had people come to me, and it's a marketing firm, and they're doing something, and it's data science, it's highly artificial intelligence oriented. And they have, for example, a L'Oreal come to them and say, can you find me somebody in Vietnam that does basically, how does a middle class in Vietnam look like for a L'Oreal brand, and how do we go out to them? They just can't be bothered to do that because they have plenty of business here. They don't know who to go and reach there, how to set up ground operations. So, it's a really, I think it's, and what they have in terms of the AI here is unmatchable there. So there is a need, and there's a genuine need to go and, so these.
But what they don't have is the training models.
And they don't have the training models to get there.
And the other thing is, I think because you've got 11 different countries in ASEAN, what you don't really see is the fact that you've got 600 million people and a huge percentage of the world's GDP coming out of Southeast Asia now.
Right.
I think people are missing that still. And it is harder to do business.
It is hard to do it,
That's a very good point.
But there's a lot of cash in that region too. There's a lot of cash, and actually, it's not talked about in the media, but a lot of the larger companies are paying attention to what's going on. So they are doing things in the background, to position themselves in the country, in the region. Yeah.
The way I would do it is look at how industries in the U.S. have become more efficient. And you don't have to invent new technology because their counterparts in these ASEAN markets, the banks, the hospitals, certainly the schools, will be happy to use the best practices. This is like franchising Starbucks all over Southeast Asia. I mean, the model works, and then it grows really fast. That works, and I've seen that happen many times. It's not exciting to me as a patent attorney because they didn't invent anything new. They're just moving it to a different part of the planet.
But, although I have to say Southeast Asia is, and cross-border and all that is great, but Southeast Asia is microcosms of different sorts of, Vietnam is vastly different to Indonesia, is vastly different to Philippines. And so, is your addressable market really 600 million, or is it, do you want to concentrate on a country, get it right?
100 million here, 80 million there.
Yeah,
right.
Right. That's a good point.
And that's the argument for Indonesia. There's a lot of concentration or interest in Indonesia because they see it as a larger addressable market.
250 million people, right. Yeah. Ray.
I'm very curious about how Chinese companies are investing in the region. So I understand the investment side, but what are the rate of success of them penetrating in the market in Southeast Asia? Other way to say, what are the startups focusing on local perspective? Is there any difference on strategies, or how do you think about the success of, in general, big players like Tencent or Alibaba?
I think that Tencent has invested in a lot of different countries and a lot of different domains, and some of them have been really early investments. For example, MDAC, which is basically a multi-currency trading platform out of Singapore, was very much under the radar. And that's when Ant Financial came in and invested in them. And so there are these kinds of early stage investments, and they kind of grow it. And then they have operating partners that come in from China and sit on the boards of these companies, sit on the C levels of these companies and help it grow. And so it's beyond investment. It's also operating partnership, which is China recognized that Southeast Asia early on needed that. That push towards sort of how do we get this this operational to the next level, and then there are some later stage investments, and that's classically you've seen it in Lazada, and Lazada also has been interesting because it's a much later stage investment, but still now suddenly there is the mothership is coming in. Lucy Peng is sitting on she's the CEO now. So the operational models are vastly different. And frankly, and then there's, Gojeks of the world where they just kind of let it run. So it's all, it's different styles of management of these investments. If I'm answering your question, but I do think that Southeast Asia is too nascent, and even the startup ecosystem is too nascent for there to just be sort of a cookie cutter model yet. But they're experimenting with different things, and they've been very successful. The valuations of the companies that they've invested in has gone up. I don't know the exact numbers, and I don't want to misquote any number, but the valuations, they've been able to provide significant lift in the valuations.
I wouldn't be surprised if it's also played for information strategically.
That's right.
Really understanding how all the consumers behave in each of these markets,
Absolutely.
and then using those acquisitions as a distribution channel for their products, right? Like Xiaomi, and
Absolutely.
if they're going to sell their phones, they want to sell their phones to a new market. Let them understand the consumers, the way they behave. They might have applications that cater specifically to those consumers, but they've gathered the intelligence and they've planted their operations already in the country. So
Absolutely, I agree with that. It's consumer behavior, it's data. There's just a lot of, there's a lot of crystal ball elements to this, where, you don't know how they're going to be able to leverage the data maybe 5 years from now. And so it's a very interesting, development.
So they're still, the way to say they're still in the phase of development.
They are.
I think kind of as a way to sum up what we're talking about, you're looking at a really new system.
Yeah.
Compared to this, the entrepreneurial ecosystem of China is 20 years older, right? Really started to take off in the mid-1990s and has had a generation to grow. This is this generation, the first generation here in Southeast Asia. So one reason we didn't even have to talk about exits is because basically it's a little too early to start to talk about exits. And I think that what you're seeing is a lot of economic activity. You're seeing an emerging ecosystem for entrepreneurship, which leads to a lot of challenges and difficulties, but it's a very exciting part of the world and not to be ignored. We've got refreshments outside, and I want to thank Stack for co-sponsoring our refreshments today. And I hope that you'll stay afterward with me and talk to our panelists more outside. Thanks to all of you for coming, and please join me for thanking a great panel. Thank you very much.